Yeah. I thought maybe 7.
Oh.
I don't know. I don't think everyone confirmed if they were coming in person or virtually.
Can I say how sad I was that you moved the meeting? So I live a block and a half.
Oh.
I know. I was like,
I am so
you
sorry.
know, I'm gonna leave my apartment at 12:52.
No.
Yeah.
The plan was to
It's
have
always
it
better
there,
in Brooklyn.
but then the tech set up, like we were able to do the hybrid.
Yes, I had to actually go to work on Governor's Island today.
Um,
Otherwise, I wasn't going to.
Future meetings we hope to host.
Yeah, the next series, we should have it up and running.
Great. We'll give folks a few minutes to get settled and get here. Maybe start 5 minutes after.
Yeah.
We shared this in the email, but just want to make sure everyone knows we're planning to record the meeting, mostly for notes, and it's going to be posted on the site, which will be on that as well.
Yeah.
You do. I'm moving into our office.
Nice. Wow,
Everybody do have a home staff. All morning.
that's great though. Yeah. Where's the office?
You know, the property that recently changed hands and was kind of stuck for a while, at Conover and Van Dyke and micro warehouses.
Yeah.
So we have one of the spaces up there, but like one of the indoor, not the pretty outdoor ones, but
Got it.
that's great.
Cool.
Already met a lot of people there, it's brought a lot of people to the neighborhood, so.
Nice. That's great. Carly, have you met Erin? I'm sorry. Have you told me that?
Sorry.
Aaron Schiffman, Brooklyn Locals Innovation.
Oh, I know.
Gotcha.
Carly runs the Red Hook Merchant Association, Business Alliance, I'm sorry. Red Hook Business Alliance.
I was reading about Lundy's.
Yeah, it's very exciting. Very
Exciting.
exciting.
What was the former occupant of that?
They did it allow you now.
Lilies, something like that. But we should do.
It's Beard Street,
I
right?
think if you can from your phone, if it was letting
And
you.
white,
let's
Go
do
for that.
Yeah,
right across.
that might be convenient too.
Yeah, well,
No, I
come on
thought-
now. It's ready to love over the winter.
We're not next month.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Just give folks a few more minutes and then we'll start it.
Carolina just checked in. She'll be here soon.
Yeah, it's letting me.
Okay. That works. Yeah, you're good to advance the slide. Okay, thank you. And the folks online, can you all hear us okay?
Yes.
Hey,
hi. Just want to do some ladies.
okay, that sounds good, and then we'll get started once you're.
Sorry, everyone. Where is that?
Yeah, I can show you.
I'm straight across the kitchen. Hi, how are you doing?
Mallory, hi, nice to
Hi, I
meet you.
can't shake hands.
It's okay.
We're not right now.
Yeah, oh, good.
Much slower with this. I'll be back.
Really, did you remember the advisory group that Resilient Red Hook hosted? You don't remember?
No, I wasn't at
Okay.
that one. And a couple other times they've met, but, last recent one. Betty, why did you go?
She took Carolina to the bathroom.
Would you guys mind hiring?
I am focused on local hiring, though, kind of defined it as a fellowship,
Yeah, right.
to kind of graduate people out of some of the internship programs in the neighborhood. So there's two people who are part of the, Merchant Privacy Council. Yeah. They're RHI or RAP or movie programs. And then a local artist who's looking for part-time work. It's a great team, really excited. There's just a lot of. So. Take. Get there.
I'm good, how are you?
Hi, how are you?
Hey,
Hi, nice to see you.
how you doing?
Good.
Hey, guys. Oh, wow.
Okay. I think we're good to get started.
How are you? Yeah.
Not working.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I mean, I know, and they've been really, they've often, honestly, it's just
So what did change?
well, that, yes. It's just a capacity issue. Have you toured the space after the press there? There's a lot of build out.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just usually work for the chair. Thank you.
I'm Mallory, by the way.
Hi, I'm Randy. How are you?
Nice to meet you.
Good.
Okay, I think we're gonna get started. Thanks everyone for joining. My name is Chris Rice. I'm with WXY. We're helping to facilitate the planning process. Welcome to the Maritime Industrial Small and Local Business Advisory Group for the Brooklyn Marine Terminal Project. Excited to have you all be part of the conversation. I think just some housekeeping at the top. In the future, we plan to send agendas and the pre-read materials and further in advance. So apologies that it sort of came late. That's something we're going to be working on. And we also hope to hold the future meetings on site at BMT so that you all don't have to come into the city. But today's overarching goals really want to sort of spend time making sure that you understand the engagement process and sort of what will come out of this, the resulting vision document. We want to review some of the initial opportunities and constraints, and then really just have a facilitated discussion to sort of inform a set of priorities and concerns to inform the planning team at this early stage. Next slide. This is the agenda. So we'll do introductions, do a little bit on process and engagement to date, present sort of on those opportunities and constraints and have discussion. But we want this to be informal and conversational. So definitely feel free to sort of interrupt me during the presentation portion. And then we'll sort of end with next steps. So with that, we'll start with introductions and maybe I'll pass it over to Jesse to sort of kick us off.
I'm Jessie Solomon. I'm the Executive Director of Southwest Brooklyn Industrial Development Corporation, SBIDC. Most of you know me, but we've been around for 45 years serving industrial and manufacturing businesses in Red Hook, Gowanus, and Sunset Park. I'm the chair of this group. And when you think of opportunity in the context of BMT project, what's the first word that comes to mind? I'll say freight.
Oh, wow, okay. Randy Pierce, Brooklyn Chamber of Commerce, transformative.
Everyone, my name is Rachel. I'm with EDC. We started about a month ago, so excited to get to know you all. I think one word that comes to mind is similar to you, transformation. Yeah.
Mike Cohen, I'm the partnership manager at the New York Harbor School on Governor's Island. And the first word that comes to mind is access.
Good afternoon, Aaron Schiffman, Brooklyn Workforce Innovations. Careers.
Carly Red Hook Business Alliance and Investment.
I'm Mallory Patch. I'm with WXY. I also just started, and I'm gonna echo access. I like that one.
So I'm Carlina Salguero, and I'm the founder and ED of Portside, New York, a maritime nonprofit. And so for those of you at the table who are new to Portside or the EDC, I just want to say that we are a tenant, but at a smaller footprint than the EDC promised us. So we're supposed to be a maritime center, actually with a very strong pipeline to careers on workboats. It's actually the focus. And the EDC did not provide that space, and we've been trying to get space and permissions to do that. Some of it is even permissions with boats alongside, not just land space. So for me, the first word is maritime, which is a big envelope that includes freight and more.
And your most favorite, famous tenant? Shipcat,
Chicklet,
Chicklet.
that's right. Shipcat Chicklet, I have to say, yes, is quite famous.
Follow Chicklet on Instagram. It is the best Instagram.
Chicklet's got to be posting more often. Thank you for that plug. I have to talk to her. She's been dropping the ball lately.
Thank you, Carolina. And we'll go to the folks online, and maybe Preston, you could kick us off.
Hey everybody, good morning. Or good afternoon now actually. My name is Preston Anderson. I'm Assistant Vice President on the Economic Mobility team here at EDC, working to stand up EDC's workforce development and entrepreneurship strategies where EDC has an outsized presence, where EDC has place-based initiatives, I should say. Good to be with you all today. The word that comes to mind for me, not to be redundant for my team's name, but upward mobility in the context of BMT projects. I think that's what comes to mind for me.
Great.
And I guess we go to Betty. I don't know who else is actually online here.
Can't see the names. It looks maybe Justin Spear.
James.
James Spear. Thanks.
Just getting there. Yep. Hi, good afternoon. My name is James Spear. I'm the Director of Professional Mariner Training at SUNY Maritime College. We focus on training STCW renewal and revalidation for the maritime workforce, both at sea and afloat, or at sea and ashore, and are spearheading the school's efforts for GWO training, as well as all of the energy transition courses. Word that comes to mind, I'll be redundant and say workforce development.
Stephen, we'll go to you next if you're able to come off mute.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephen Lyman. I am the Executive Director of the Maritime Association of the Port of New York and New Jersey. What comes to mind when we think about opportunity in the context of the BMT project is re-envisioning supply chain for New York and the boroughs of New York, as well as New Jersey, the whole entire port region.
What are you next?
Good morning, everyone. Apologies for my tardiness. I'm Lorian Farrell. I'm the Deputy Commissioner for the Bureau of Coastal Resilience, DEP, New York City. The opportunity that I think of course, is protecting the city from flooding, first and foremost. But what keeps coming to mind for me is the opportunity to create a really cool education component in this site and public access so that public is more engaged with the infrastructure that surrounds us and helps us live and the way we do. So I'd love to see some elements integrated into the site that are dedicated to space for bringing the public in to see this systems at work.
Thank you. Chris Rice with WXY. I'm going to say transformation as well. Go to the next slide. Just want to set out some guidelines for productive dialogue. If you go to the next slide, we want people to share and be active participants. So take space, make space. You know, if you've been speaking a lot, make space for others to join in. Share from your own experience. So we try to say, you know, promote I statements and avoid overgeneralizations. We want folks to be actively engaged, so act as a collaborator, not a spectator. And then again, sort of this idea of wait, why am I talking or why aren't I talking? So giving space and making sure that everyone has room to contribute. So just want to, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the sort of project overall, but just wanted to do a little bit of level setting. These are the project goals that the city introduced early on in the project. So supporting a clean and modern maritime port that creates jobs and industry growth, reducing emissions across operations and related activity. There's this focus on creating a new mixed-use residential development for the community, investing in neighborhood opportunities, and creating more open space and waterfront access, integrating environmental justice by addressing current and historic environmental inequities, complementing and connecting with the surrounding communities. Neighborhood integration is a big part of this, protecting the site against increasing threats from climate change, improving mobility, mitigating traffic disruptions, and then of course, supporting the long-term financial sustainability of the site overall.
Hi.
We're just getting started. Once you all get settled, we can introduce yourselves.
Okay. Hi, I'm Mallory.
Be further from the screen, you could sit here.
We're just asking everyone to say their name, their affiliation, and then sort of one word that comes to mind when you think about opportunity in the context of BMT. So maybe you can kick us off here. Either one of you.
Michael Lopez, I'm from the Red Hook Initiative. Opportunity is the word. Local hiring.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Danielle Zuckerman, Director of Government Affairs at DOT. I guess my first word is possibilities.
And we'll end with you, ma'am. The first, so name,
Oh.
yep, that's all right.
Sorry, I thought we were going this way. Hi, everyone. I'm Nikki Evans. I'm the Senior Vice President for Workforce Development and Education at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And I guess for me, it would be connectivity.
Great, thank you. Okay, then we'll go to the next slide. I think you all are familiar with the project area, but just want to again level set us here. So the BMT project area runs from Pier 7 at the north, just abutting Brooklyn Bridge Park, includes Pier 8, Piers 9A and 9B, Pier 10 of the Red Hook Container Terminal, and then down Pier 11 and Pier 12, which is the Brooklyn Cruise Terminal. Next slide. So I think probably many of you are aware, but a few weeks ago, the city announced a sort of extension to the overall timeline for this project. They had added an additional 3 months of time. So right now the project is expected, this sort of portion of the project is expected to end March 2025. And so we wanted to sort of talk through what we think we've gained through with those additional 3 months. So obviously more time for planning and engagement. We've planned additional public workshops, both in person and virtual. We've tried to be responsive to a lot of feedback on the format of the workshops to date. So there'll be varied formats moving forward, including presentations, opportunities for question and answer, small group discussion, and small group work sessions. There'll be an additional task force meeting, and we've not quite yet. And then we've done some targeted engagement for underrepresented groups, which I'll touch on in more detail. And just making sure that there's a real clear integration between the work of the planning team and the engagement teams. Next slide. So this is the updated timeline. We're here in sort of in the middle of November. The next public workshop we anticipate being somewhere around early or mid-December, both a virtual and in-person workshop. From there, there'd be a third set of workshops sort of focused on exploring solutions or getting into more sort of site-specific scenarios and actions, testing out some ideas using a physical model. And the idea is that in February, we sort of present some set of scenarios to the public for their review and feedback and prioritization. I will say this is a very iterative process. It's kind of changing and evolving every day. So we'll continue to update you as things move forward. The task force is basically meeting on a monthly cadence. The next task force meeting is next week on the 18th. And then it'll sort of move on that monthly cadence. I think Task Force 4, will focus on sort of testing out site-specific ideas. From there, moving into sort of some set of scenarios, And then from there, moving into sort of developing a preferred site plan with sort of specific information on sort of location of uses, distribution of open space, if there's housing, things like that, density, and then voting on a final vision plan towards the end of March. Yes.
Which piece of feedback on the tool that I think I saw pictures of?
Yes.
Haven't been able to share it yet, so I'll just share it now. It looks like that tool is really not specific to a port property, and I'm worried that it's maybe an inappropriate tool to be using as a toy to sort of build the space. Can we think about using a modeling tool that is a little bit more appropriate for a port property?
Yes, I think maybe we can put a bit of a pin in that because I want to understand the idea more specifically, because we're basically building a physical model that just represents the site as it is today. And then we'll have various pieces that relate to some of the ideas coming out of the process that folks can interchange, interplay. It'll be connected to sort of like the financial model and sort of metrics related to the site. So I guess I would love to kind of have a deeper conversation just to understand the concern. And just one more note on this timeline. The advisory groups, just want to highlight those. We're sort of in our first set of those right now. We anticipate having the second set of advisory group meetings in December, which would also start to inform those site-specific ideas and inform scenarios. And then the idea is that around sometime in February, we'll have sort of draft scenarios for the advisory groups to sort of provide direct feedback on. And as sort of facilitators, we're taking everything we're hearing here, synthesizing that, bringing it directly to the task force to inform their thinking as we move through the process. Just quickly on the task force leadership, I think most folks are aware, but it's led by Chair Congressman Dan Goldman and the two vice chairs, Councilmember Aviles and State Senator Andrew Bernardes. And the task force is really responsible for, guiding and approving the planning priorities and supporting stakeholder engagement. As I said, they will vote on the vision plan at the end of this process. They attend task force meetings, working to build consensus around a vision for the plan, and also helping communicate sort of just information about the project overall. Oh, yes. If you just want to introduce yourself.
Brian Coleman, I apologize for being late.
Okay, there is a seat at the table here if you want to. And then the advisory group. So why are we here today? We're asking you all to sort of attend the 3 meetings that we've laid out. We're asking you to review materials and come prepared to meetings. As I said, we plan to share materials with further advance moving forward. We want you all to actively participate. And we really see your role as kind of providing specific feedback on the sort of planning framework and topics as the planning process moves forward, and specifically thinking about your sort of vantage point and expertise and perspective. And then also communicating information about the project. One question that's come up is there going to be an opportunity for all the AG members to sort of speak to one another? We're not creating that formal opportunity, understanding that this is a volunteer process. You're not being compensated for your time. And so we're trying to sort of maintain some bounds on the ask. That being said, we have encouraged folks who may organize outside of this process. We had our first waterfront meeting last week, and folks were eager to sort of meet and chat without us as facilitators. We've also encouraged the chairs to communicate and coordinate as well.
Can you provide contact information for everyone in all those groups? Because not every organization's website actually has an email address for a person.
That has come up, yes, and we can provide the advisory group members' contact information. This is just a summary of sort of what I just talked through. Today's meeting will be a little bit more open-ended. We want to sort of get an understanding of your initial priorities and concerns so that can inform the task force thinking and the planning team's work. Meeting 2 will focus more on sort of site-specific ideas to sort of inform scenarios moving forward. And then that 3rd meeting we anticipate at this moment really focusing on reviewing those specific scenarios to inform that final site plan at the end of the process. Quickly want to just talk through what we're envisioning for the public workshops. The next set is supposed to take place in December. We see this largely focused on opportunities and constraints. We want to introduce a set of guiding principles that will sort of be touch points and reference points for decision making as we move forward. We think there's an opportunity to sort of educate the public around working waterfronts and just provide case studies around sort of mixed use ports and other types of ports throughout both nationally and internationally. Something that's come up a lot so far is sort of acknowledging and integrating planning efforts. So that's something we envision. And really collecting feedback on those big opportunities and constraints to inform sort of more specific site planning and ultimately scenarios. To the next slide, just to give you a quick recap, this is from our workshop back in September at the Mikio Center, where we really just introduced the planning process, trying to build a shared understanding of the site, given that a lot of folks are not able to get on site. And that really focused on identifying sort of high-level priorities. Next slide. This is just sort of a representative photo of what we imagine for workshop 2, having a centralized presentation, opportunity to answer questions, and then having folks discuss information sort of in small groups with a facilitator. Workshop 3, we are actually plan to build a physical model of the site. And I think, Carly, this is what you're speaking to. And using the physical model connected both to the planning analysis, financial analysis to have folks iterate on the site themselves, and also it really dive into the trade-offs between different uses on the site.
Yeah, so those colored pieces don't necessarily represent the types of things that might be at a port.
Yes, okay, I think I misunderstood your question. This is just an example of this. So the pieces that we're developing would obviously be specific to the port itself.
And then in addition to the financial metrics, we also need to include the legal obligations.
Yes.
That'll be part of making those decisions.
Yes, and Carly, just for everyone's context, Carly has raised the Community Leadership and Climate Protection Act, which has a requirement that 30 to 40% of investment go into what the state calls disadvantaged communities. That's something we want to address at the next task force meeting. Most of the site is actually a DAC, including the Columbia Waterfront Street District and all of Red Hook. So I think Carly has raised this question of whatever comes out of this process investment should be going, and I don't want to speak for you, but.
Yeah, well, and also the city process, which is underway for environmental justice, which is measuring and either offsetting, mitigating, or preventing burdens versus benefits, and that all has to be quantified. So as a part of that process, if we're going to talk about the financial piece, we would also need to talk about those obligations.
Yes, absolutely. And yes, and I will just say environmental justice is one of the metrics that we're thinking about sort of broadly for the site, and hope to build that out further. Okay, next slide. And then again, this is just an example photo to sort of show what things could look like in terms of the engagement itself, but having a set of scenarios that the public can engage with and provide direct feedback on as part of the last series of workshops.
I'm sorry, I just need to say that like hokey rinky dink for port discussion. Most people have no idea what a cold storage warehouse is. I'm waiting to hear where the I spent 10 years almost inside the port with the Mary Whalen in there. So I'm pretty conversant with what these things look like. There's no way to render that. And if the public doesn't know, that's also fine. Let's just put more housing there. And I really feel like there's like a big setup for that. People don't know where's customs. How are you going to illustrate the customs inspection? Do you have hustlers? Do you have the crane repair shop in here? There are incredible number of existing functions, plus all the stuff that has been talked about and promised vis-a-vis Marine Highway. I don't see how those things are rendered in any way with kind of Lego facsimiles. And I find it to the point of irresponsible, because you can't actually discuss those stuff with plastic modules. They don't exist probably, but they're not known to the community unless you happen to be working in the port, that port, or in maritime in general. And there are plenty of people working in maritime who don't actually understand the operations within that port because it's highly specific. I don't respect that. And I support Carly and her expressions of doubt. Now that I've seen more about it, I'm flabbergasted.
Totally hear you. And I'm happy to have a conversation with you about that exercise and the pieces we're developing and building. I don't want to take too much time on process because we really want to focus on sort of the opportunities and constraints. Obviously, if folks want to talk about that, we can make space for that. But we're not prepared today to sort of have the detailed discussion on all of the various pieces. We're building that out, and we can come back to you with all that information. But there's going to be, I think, to address the critical point that you raised, is we're not going to sort of bring generic pieces to the public and have them engage with them. There's a huge part of the workshop, which is education and sort of talking through the various pieces themselves in a detailed manner so that folks can actually engage with the site in an informed way, both from the specific port uses and the financial metrics that inform any trade-offs that folks may consider. So Happy to
So just to
continue
be
that.
clear,
Yeah.
we'll have better Lego pieces at the end, right?
I
We will-
do think too,
Yeah.
part of in the discussion, we really want to talk about what priority issues this vision plan should focus on. Not, maybe today isn't the right place to talk about exactly how the modeling works, but I do think that the consensus of this group, whatever consensus we build on what priority issues we should be addressing, especially if we think the priority issue should be the redevelopment of the port and other maritime industrial uses on the site, that should influence what happens at the community meeting.
100%.
All those community
Yeah,
meetings
exactly.
reflect those
Yeah, there's a chicken and the egg
priorities.
problem. I think what you're saying, right? That's because
I think we want to zoom out as a group today
Yeah.
and, begin that discussion about what our priority issues that we're solving for on the site.
But can I just add something there? Is that in a lot of ways, we're all subject matter experts and the general public is not. And so when any activity we do with them should meet them where they are and do that respectfully. So while I understand all the concerns you're raising about customs, chicken and egg and all of those types of things, those things, if you start throwing those things at the public, it's gonna feel like you're trying to basically waterboard them with information and it's gonna cause them to disconnect. So there's a balancing game here that I hope that as we zoom out, that we take into consideration so that people can feel like they are truly being able to be a part of this discussion rather just being spectators in it.
Actually, I do education and interpretation before. It's a main function of my nonprofit. And so we have found ways to actually engage the public and make them interested in this. And so just my concern is that actually hasn't happened. The public has actually not had a town hall to explain the port and how it works and what is maritime. And so, and then, so I feel this has to do with the process, it's not a failing of the public, is to then set this up. It's very set up for pro-housing and discussing housing and those kinds of models. And I think that's actually not fair to the community. And I think there are ways to talk about these things that are not condescending or alienating, because that's what I've been doing for 2 decades now.
No, and I totally understand all of that. I just wanted to just highlight that, just because, again, trying to explain exactly what the Brooklyn Navy Yard does. I have to be very thoughtful about how I engage the public and everything like that, so that people understand what types of jobs, what types of opportunity, what type of companies. And it's just something that I learned, and I don't want to take away from you guys, but I just wanted to put that out there. I'm quite sure that there are ways to do that. And if you have suggestions, I think that we can definitely talk about how that might be rendered. But I just don't want us to lose the fact that ultimately the whole point of this process is to make people feel included in it. And I've just seen too many of these situations where people get so caught up in the lingo, the language, and their own kind of perspective that they forget that the public isn't there with us every day. They don't see the same things that we see. So
Appreciate that. Yeah, I definitely think we want to highlight having a process that's accessible to a wide range of community members, but is also rooted in information and data analysis and making that information accessible so folks can engage in a meaningful way.
Well, let's back up and then answer a very basic question. Beyond the task force,
Yes.
what is the goal of engaging the public?
The goal of engaging the public is to help shape the vision for the BMT site.
And is it an open-ended vision?
Yes.
It's an open-ended vision.
No, it isn't, because it's already talking about housing on a port. And so this is one of my concerns. We're
Open-ended.
supposed to be here to talk about the visions, but you've actually already established that it's housing and mixed use. And I'm
No.
telling you, I'm hearing a lot of people concerned about it, or not even in
Yeah,
maritime.
Could we let him?
Yeah.
So I want to be clear, the vision is open-ended but the city has set a framework and that is what the project goals lay out. And so I don't want to misspeak there.
I think that that's a very important distinction. 40 some odd years almost, we've been doing this. There's different types of community engagement. There's community engagement that's an open-ended vision, right? In other words, you've got
Yes.
an empty palette and you've got a set of community priorities. That's not this.
Correct. That is
That's
correct.
not
So the
this.
city has said they want this to be a modern maritime port. They have set that out as the
The
frame.
goal is for us to come to conclusion with a vision. It's not an open-ended process.
Correct.
I will share that at the task force meeting, when we look at that list of goals, we understand that it's not a very good list of goals because it means that this tiny, funny little strip of land has to be everything to everything, everybody in all agencies, and it may not be feasible or wise or effective or successful. So I do think that as an advisory group, all the research that's being done right now and frankly hasn't been shared may need to backwards influence that set of goals because it may not actually be reasonable. And some of those things can be achieved, but not on the site.
Understood. Yeah.
I concur, and very well put.
I want to keep us moving forward so we can get to the discussion, but I appreciate all the feedback thus far. I'm going to move through this very quickly, but just to highlight some of our initial engagement. To date, we've engaged around 1,800 community members, 450 through the virtual workshop, the virtual information session in August. We had 280 people join the workshop at the Mikio Center and around 100 join the second version at 125 Summit. We had over 800 people respond to an initial community survey, and we anticipate releasing another survey later in the process. Reached around 100 people, 300 people across tabling events, and we have ongoing feedback sessions at 90 Columbia Street, and we have 3 planned at the Red Hook Art Project. We've had 1 thus far, and 1 is tonight, and 1 is next week. This is just to give you a kind of peek at the first workshop. You can move forward. This is the second workshop at Sacred Hearts and St. Stephen. Keep going. And I'm going to just talk through what is a very high level set of emerging themes. So again, we're going to have a lot deeper engagement moving forward. So this will continue to be updated, but some of what we're hearing thus far, and I think it's worth me just noting at the top that looking at the survey in particular, we're mostly hearing from white residents from Columbia Street waterfront and Cobble Hill. We're not hearing a lot from Red Hook residents and Red Hook Houses residents in particular. So we've already developed a strategy to start to reach those groups, and I can talk about that in more detail. So we're very aware of that, and that's going to inform our strategy moving forward. But some of the emerging themes, lots of enthusiasm for parks and open space and recreational amenities, lots of concern around industrial air pollution, the need for flood protection, just overall resiliency in the area, interest in addressing traffic and improving public transportation options, a lot of anxiety around the traffic from the BQE. The city is closely coordinating with DOT on the BQE vision plans, and just sort of general concerns around pedestrian safety. What we've heard thus far in terms of housing is a real opposition to sort of luxury high rises, in particular, concerns around sort of like height and density and sort of towers on the waterfront. There's definitely emerged the sort of tension between wanting to preserve the working waterfront, but also how do you do that sort of in a thoughtful and considered way, while also protecting sort of nearby residents. Strong desire to maintain small and local businesses in the area, and sort of mixed feelings over the cruise industry. And I think in particular, the impacts of the cruise, especially as it relates to traffic when folks are coming in and out of the cruise terminal. And then we've seen sort of a request for educational programming and space to support maritime training, with a real priority on sort of local community members, prioritizing them and sort of future job opportunities. Next slide. Now I'm going to just talk through some very basic sort of site context and opportunities slides. And then we will move into the discussion portion. Slide. So this map really just outlines that today there are several non-maritime uses, and that the site overall just needs significant investment to fix existing issues. But it's a very large site, as you all know. It's over 100 acres. And so there's flexibility for multi-purpose solutions in the future. Around 60 acres of the site is currently non-maritime, meaning that they don't have any, they're non-water dependent uses, and don't necessarily need to be located near the waterfront. I'm gonna ask you all to hold because I know there's gonna be a lot of questions and feedback, but I just want to get through this and then we can open it up. I think it'll be more efficient. So in any port, the working waterfront industry requires a maritime security zone, which is the MARSEC zone, which was shown on the last slide. So and folks cannot access the MARSEC zone. It's not publicly accessible. So here we're showing piers 9A and 9B, which are currently too deteriorated to be safe for use. If you go to the next slide, the city has won a federal $164 million mega grant. A large portion of that has been slated and will be. So raising this idea of what's fixed and what isn't. The city has won funds to build a marginal pier at this site, and that is the intention. And as far as we know, the elections will not impact the funding. Next slide. So the Hugh Carrier Brooklyn Battery Tunnel runs right through BMT. It's an important access site for the neighborhoods nearby and as the city as a whole. Having the tunnel here, our understanding is that no big foundations or dredging of the water can happen at the center area. So this affects what can be built on top of it and which types of vessels can access the northern edge of the site. The piers that are shown in yellow have constraints that we cannot put large heavy uses on the locations or ones that require foundations.
Hi.
Next slide. It's moving into the opportunities here. So based on our initial analysis, BMT has the potential to be planned not just for today's maritime uses, but also the industries coming in the future. Right now, the waterfront generates around 500 jobs, but we think there's the potential to increase that and increase access to good and green maritime jobs in the future. And a flexible marine terminal could accommodate green industries that are starting to emerge or ones that have not yet been invented. Slide. BMT can increase jobs and accelerate the local economy while also potentially routing truck traffic off neighborhood streets or onto waterways via the city's Blue Highways initiative. The main access points for the industrial uses are Hamilton, Atlantic, and Congress, which makes sense as key entrances, and exits. Go back one, sorry, because they're closest to the highways, and the site may be able to further draw trucks off local streets. There's been a lot of interest in trying to get trucks off the neighborhood grid and onto the site. Next slide. Nearby neighborhoods have seen some new housing and some declines in housing. Rent burden in this area is at 35%. While that is of course too high, it is lower than the citywide rent burden, 43%. Next slide. We all well know the vulnerability of Red Hook and Columbia Street waterfront district to flooding from big storms like Sandy and also day-to-day tidal flooding. There's already much protection work happening with the Red Hook Coastal Resiliency Project. We think this is an opportunity to integrate with the planning process to ensure that there's a high level of protection while also potentially providing new public access and green space. It was also determined that BMT has a private sewer. As a part of EDC taking on ownership, they are analyzing and mapping that, and we plan to have more information on that once that analysis is complete. Next slide. BMT is the biggest public inaccessible waterfront area to the public in the Inner Harbor, but it's also an incredibly important industrial area and will continue to be. By reworking the industry to be more optimized, potentially, we have the opportunity to provide more waterfront access to all surrounding neighborhoods. This could include a variety of types of open space, greenways, parks, pocket parks, waterfront promenades, etc. And then lastly, we feel that BMT could potentially be a site that centers belonging and accessibility. It's a large site for the city as a whole and can offer many benefits both locally and citywide. I think I'll just pause there. I will say before folks jump into sort of questions and reactions, just highlighting the guidelines for productive dialogue. We want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to contribute. And so if you're taking up space, please also make space for others as well in the conversation. Good. Again, this is sort of initial site opportunities and constraints. Any initial questions or comments?
I have a question because there were documents that were sent yesterday. Are we discussing those today too? Because there was something called the pre-read, which was talking about site conditions, which has very different content than that. So are we getting to that too?
And so if you want to raise things from the pre-read, the pre-read has a lot of detailed information and we can't walk through every bit of that in this meeting. So we synthesize what we think are some of the big takeaways in this presentation. So they're related to one another. But if you have a question about the pre-read, yes, please.
This is my word through. I've got 3 pages of comments to through your documents. So if you send me homework, I'm gonna do it. So, I mean, I don't want to take up space according to your thing here, but there are a lot of things that I felt were overlooked or sometimes actually incorrect. in Those documents.
Well, I think if there's something you want to raise that's important for the group to hear, do that. If we can also have a one-on-one and you can submit your questions and comments. Because I do want to make sure that everyone here is engaged in the conversation.
I guess because since this isn't aligning with the homework that we got, I'm not trying to figure out what the process is here. So when is the opportunity to bring up certain things? And one of them is discussing what you presented. And then there's the meta level question as to what are our priorities. I think some of us in here really want to be talking about, we're really interested in maritime industrial. When do we have that conversation?
That is the next portion. The rest.
Or I'm gonna wait then. I won't take time because I can email it to you and the group, but let's see what happens. I want to get to that big picture of.
Just a procedural question. There's been a lot of feedback on some of those slides already. Will there be a process where those are updated to include updated information?
Yes, so as I said, this is an iterative process. We're sharing the same information with all the advisory groups for the first round of the information and the analysis, and anything we produce for the next round of meetings will be updated, and that goes same for the community engagement as well.
Actually, I have one thing I do want to bring up about those slides. I've been wondering why the NYC Ferry Home Port number 2 installation in Atlantic Basin on Pier 11 is stopped. And in one of the slides on page 8, it says, assuming home port number 2 is fixed. Can you please explain?
You go back to that slide.
I don't think you addressed it here. That was in the document from last night, but that's a large footprint in a Atlantic Basin is a precious maritime asset being protected body of water, totally underused from a maritime point of view. There's a large footprint right there allocated to that. And I also want to know if you know, can you speak to what's happening with home port number 2?
So I think home port number 2 is being considered as part of the planning process. There's no fixed decision around whether home port 2 would stay at that exact location or if it could move somewhere
What does
else
the
on
phrase assuming home port number 2 is fixed? Is there something to fix?
I can follow up with EDC on that. I have to.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Could you go back to one of the earliest slides? I had a question. I don't know if I misread it or if yeah, this is the one.
And Brian, I'm sorry, will you introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Brian Coleman. I again apologize for being late. I run the Greenpoint Manufacturing Design Center in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. So the pink is all non-maritime use? You consider it all non-maritime?
Sorry, let's speak the hatch, the sort of red hatch over the pink.
Oh,
that
the
is
red,
non-
oh,
that is
okay,
non-maritime
okay,
uses, yes.
okay, fine.
Part of
Again,
the clarification that came up in our group conversations is, and which is why this is a very confusing slide, those could be used, those are represent businesses that could be using the water and
Yes.
just aren't currently.
That-
So it's unclear what this slide is trying to.
Also, there's wharfage there. So where you have the pink thing, there's actually active vessel docking, except on the 2 condemned piers. And you've got non-maritime use for 2 piers that were just condemned, so that's not fair. It makes it look like that it's not, you know, it's like wasted. So I think this is a very misleading slide.
I'd have to agree.
Yeah, and you're thinking about 60 acres are non-maritime use. I mean, really, I'm really having some trouble with that.
There's also, yeah, I would echo that, and I've given this, I'm Jessie, by the way, for folks who just came in late. I'm the executive director of Southwest Brooklyn Industrial Development Corporation. We've shared this feedback too, that some of these slides and also some of the in-person tours have made it seem like the quote unquote non-waterfront active uses on the site are non-maritime uses. However, some of those uses are complementary to maritime uses. And on any port facility, you have uses that are not dependent on the water necessarily, but support the function of a larger port and terminal as well. So I do think that the language here, as we think about bringing it to the broader public, could be.
Yeah.
Yeah, like you have the executive offices and the mechanic shop as being non-maritime uses here, which is crazy land. And then also there's a bulk port there for sand and stone. So I don't know if everybody knows the piers here, but if you're counting from the left, 1, 2, between 2 and 3, they bring in sand and stone there. So there's sand and stone piles there that have actually come in by water. So that footprint is maritime. Now the cement recycling for the DOT, which is loathed by the Columbia Waterfront District coming in by truck, is in no way therefore it's land in, land out.
Yeah.
But that other, a large chunk of that, you know, so.
Yeah.
Is there a way to like kind of maybe render it in a way so that there is like direct maritime and then complementary? Because other industries do this. Manufacturing does this all the time, where you have like the factory, but then you have you have the smaller factories that feed into the factory. So they're not directly that factory or that industrial zone, but they're feeding into the ecosystem. So if we could maybe distinguish those two, so it's a little bit easier for people to make the difference between like, okay, what is directly maritime, what is supporting maritime, and then what is not maritime, that may be easier for folks to understand.
And you also have some non-maritime in your pink area there, the warehouse in Pier 11. So there are some non-maritime tenants in that shed. So, I mean, I know the site really well. I don't think it's a good graphic. Sorry.
You don't have to apologize. Thank you for the feedback. Other comments, questions?
Not on this slide, but the the slide that talked about new housing that has been built was a little jarring, talking about Gowanus, because that's all luxury housing. I think that should be made clear, because if that's a slide that went out to the public, I don't think people would take it very well.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
I don't even know why this slide is included.
Because they want to have housing on the site.
Well, I think also too, like,
I just don't know if it's germane to the specific site. I mean, granted, people might want to have housing on the site, but I mean, we don't need, I don't, it just seems out of context.
Okay. I mean, I think from my understanding from the planning team's perspective is the city has been very transparent that they want to look at housing as a potential land use on this site. And so this is to provide some context on sort of what's been built in the surrounding area. And I agree that there could be more detailed information on sort of what's luxury, what's affordable, and in the affordable bucket.
The only thing you're not doing here is showing people walking their dogs and pushing baby carriages. I mean, it's
But this to me is like going back to this issue of meeting the community where they are. If you guys take off, if you go back to the slide, these are all the themes that emerge from surveying the community. If you take housing off that and treat it as a non-starter, you're gonna have more pushback because you're literally ignoring them. People ask all the time why the Navy Yard doesn't have housing. And we actually talk them through. It's like, we have trucks coming in here all times of day and night. Do you wanna hear grinding noises at 3 a.m.? Because we got some like heavy machinery over here. So rather than make it a non-starter, explain to people why that this might not be the best site so that people start to understand. Because I think that's part of the issue why housing is a part of this conversation. There's an affordability crisis in the city. It's hitting lower income people. Not every site is suitable for it, but people don't know why, and we don't talk about it. So treat them like true community members and have the conversation.
I agree with that totally, but that's not what they've been doing. So what the city has done in the presentations is say housing is an option. And they've dangled that there without actually, and mixed use. I mean, I haven't spent years in the port here. It makes their complaints already on Pier 6 from the housing there about the lights from the port. I mean, these adjacencies are not comfortable, but that's not how it's been presented to the community. So as Carly had put it, there have been a lot of promises made in a way that may not be attainable or comfortable. I mean, frankly, mixed use is what made actually EJ issues in communities.
So am I wrong in assuming that the themes that you put up here before, they came out of the surveys, right, from the people?
No.
So who came up with those themes?
They started with them. So you go to a meeting and there are a bunch of options and you're given a bunch of options. And which dots do you like and put the dots there?
There was a survey and in the public engagement where we asked people about a set of priorities that relate to these themes. So job training, housing, open space transit. So we presented a set of initial priorities that folks could prioritize themselves. And these are the findings related to those.
Okay, so it's kind of half and half. So kind of public feedback, but also kind of the city.
But I think to the point that you raised earlier, we didn't want to enter the conversation and say anything is on the table and just, empty canvas. We wanted to say, these are the priorities that the city is thinking about and wants to bring to the conversation. Within those, what is your priority? And we wanted to create space for things outside of that as well. But I want to go here.
You can tell. I actually kind of like that housing slide. And the reason why is because, my work is on coastal resilience, so flood protection, but also trying to think about community resilience. And it's helpful to visualize sort of the dynamics of how the area around this site is evolving. And, reading a lot lately about how people are moving into floodplains. And this just sort of visualizes that. It helps me try to think, well, what does this region need and this site will fit in? It's not a site alone in isolation. It fits into this regional broader community. So thinking then maybe some of the choices for the site Obviously there's greater pressure for waterfront access and parkland because there's so many more people here. I just think that 7,000 number is really striking, and that makes me wonder, well, how does that impact what we're trying to do here on the site? So for me, it's a helpful slide, even though it's somewhat disconnected from what you're gonna do square by square on the site.
One of the other pieces of feedback that's come up on this, just for everybody's, just to share more widely, is that it doesn't include planned development. So these numbers are reflective of past, it appears, and not reflective of coming, and that really does need to be included.
Yeah, that makes sense from what I just said too. I would want to know that. What are the pressures coming?
And just to, in terms of process, look, there's blank canvas, opportunity engagement for community, participatory budgeting. Right? That's not this. There's also, there's reactive community engagement. We have a ULERP, right? That's reacting to something. This is somewhere in between. This is opportunity. From a regional planning perspective, if you had some orthodox planners in the room, this should never be a port facility at all. Now, let's just be clear. So this is about a community engagement process around a framework that's sort of already been laid out to maintain a port. When most of the port operations have already been shifted to where there should be port operations, which is Howland Hook and New Jersey. So let's just be clear about that. The highest best use of this land for the community would be housing, because that's the most important need for New York City right now, and affordable housing. But that's not what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I just want, when the EDC came to Sunset Park to have a very similar conversation as the one that's being described here, the number one concern that was brought up was housing and impact of cost of living. So to your point, it is, I understand the concern, and I guess my question is, how realistic is housing on this list? This seems to be this potentially open-ended and important thing to the city, but how realistic is it? Because I think it needs to be described to the community when that point comes, whether or not it actually is a dangling carrot or a realistic opportunity. And also the other conversation that came up, and I know it would come up with our Red Hook community as one who served the community for some time, is the impact on their cost of living. It's already quite expensive. That I find, I don't have the data to back it up, but I think the rent burden in this area being under average is very unrealistic, very unrealistic.
Right.
So how that's true when you're talking about Carroll Garden, these neighborhoods, it's an impossibility. I can't imagine it. And I think the community knows that. And if they see the slide with these percentages, it made my stomach churn, and I don't live in Red Hook at this time. So I do think that the housing conversation is important, but I think it's also about how it's described and how it's engaged. Because if it's not a realistic opportunity, it should be set up front, hey, this is not a space where living can actually happen.
I just want to make sure we hear from folks on the Zoom, because also it looks like other people have joined us. So if anyone on Zoom has questions or comments on the opportunities and constraints presented, that'd be great to hear from you.
One thing I just, in direct response to your comment, one of the city's goals at the onset of this project and as part of announcing it was thinking about this site as a potential mixed use community. And so I think just to address that question specifically of, is housing sort of just a dangling carrot? I think there's the city wants to take on a real exploration of potential housing at this site. So I appreciate that comment of sort of to help us think about how we frame that for the community in our next series of engagements, and also heard on the rent burden statistics we can review and also tighten up how we present that.
It seems to me that housing is definitely on the agenda. The question, and it's not necessarily for this advisory group, is is it going to truly be affordable housing, or is it going to be a luxury to cross subsidize some other investment? And that's sort of a very different conversation. And if it is affordable housing, there's also like how deeply is that being subsidized? And in what way does that maybe counteract any investment or subsidy of bringing some industrial jobs or green jobs to the site? And I think that's where this group should maybe put some emphasis or attention to.
And that's also something that should be brought to the community, that in thinking through like housing, you may be costing yourself some jobs and maybe better paying jobs that will allow you to better manage the rising cost of living. I think for me, what I feel like is important with this is that you're helping people to understand the trade-offs here. And we're not having the conversation about trade-offs. We're saying like, oh, housing can't happen. Well, okay, if you ask me, housing shouldn't be on this site, because if you're trying to do any type of industrial work, it's just not going to work. But you can't say that to the community and expect people just to take it because of your background. You need to say, like, there's a trade-off here. If you want more housing, that means there's probably going to be less space for businesses and jobs and opportunity here. If we take housing off or, minimize it, this is what we could do, and here's how we can invest in that. And let's talk about, now you're talking about job training, now you're talking about workforce development. Also, I noticed on the previous slide, when you're talking about themes, it said, NYCHA funding. This could be an opportunity to create more funding for the Red Hook houses, and like what could be improvements that could be made in that particular space, so that the kind of, again, the cost of living burdens and other things don't feel so real. So I think the conversation that we want to have is about trade-offs, and help the community have that conversation, because people care about jobs. Like, one of the reasons why cost of living is such a hard thing, especially for like neighborhoods like Red Hook and stuff like that, is because job quality isn't where it should be for many of those community members. But if you're going to talk about, I will say this, if you're going to talk about job quality, that needs to be real. And there needs to be real access to like maritime careers, and not kind of access, but real access. There needs to be real training programs on the table. And so we need to talk about those things.
Oh, did we see your hand up?
No, scratch.
Okay. Let's take yours, and then let's move into the formal sort of group discussion.
I want to thank you for that, but I also want to add what I'm hearing out of Red Hook in particular about housing is Red Hook was hammered by Sandy, and people are not, I mean, the idea of putting housing right there on the waterfront, and also that's on the flood side of the Red Hook Coastal Resilience Barrier is people, a lot of people's reaction is like, that's crazy land, whether they're maritime people or not. It's like, that's not where I'm hearing. I don't talk to everyone in Red Hook, but that's the feedback that I'm getting. And many people come to Portside to get, information and find out about this. And we've been messaging to tell people to be aware and get involved. There's like massive, the idea of putting housing there is really concerning to people.
I think just to echo a couple of the things, if we're gonna talk about housing, it should be about the housing needs in Red Hook. So the statistics should be reflective of the housing needs, because one of the things that tends to happen is that housing comes into the community, but it's not actually serving that community. And so people in Red Hook houses, for example, want to have their family be able to pass on that, and seniors be able to move out and things like that, and they're unable to.
Yeah.
So the statistics and the framing really needs to be about not the city's need as a whole, but the community's desire for housing, and the other opportunities, as you were just saying, in terms of NYCHA funding or funding for development at other sites that make more sense, need to be put on the table as well.
Yeah, because your housing slide also doesn't include, Red Hook is about to lose a massive amount of, they're threatened affordable housing in two places. Save Tiffany, 63 Tiffany is going on in Columbia Waterfront District as an effort for that one large building. And the Carroll Gardens Association is about to tear down housing that's been there for several decades. And the housing that they're proposing to put back, they're using a citywide AMI, so where a single person has to have an income of $90,000. That does not reflect the current residents of those housing, who that housing is historically served, and let's call it old time Red Hook. In other words, not newcomer gentrified Red Hook. So that's not on your slide here, and that's the neighborhood is really concerned about. They're trying to get information as to what Carroll Gardens Association is planning to do. And that's 3 separate locations of housing. It's not just one building, 53 Tiffany. It's multiple buildings on 3 blocks.
I think this next part of the conversation really brings us back to what the individual members of this group want to see prioritized, specifically at the Brooklyn Marine Terminal, as this plan for redevelopment happens. So we've already been dancing around this issue. We've had a lot of conversation about housing, but one thing I keep coming back to is, as Carly said, EDC has presented us, the city has presented us with several different opportunities for development on this site. It will be challenging. Most of us work in the industrial sector to some capacity. We know, as you were mentioning, some of the challenges of conflicting uses with industrial, particularly maritime industrial, particularly a container port, which exists there today. So we want to think through, I keep coming back to what problem are we trying to solve for? And I think it would be helpful if this advisory group could agree on what should be the priority issue that redevelopment on this site seeks to address. Are we laser focused on quality industrial sector jobs? Are we laser focused on career building for that sector? Are we focused on freight solutions? One thing we've really barely touched on is a major promise from the city to build out a maritime highway. We haven't talked about that at all in any of these slides, really. So should this group say, hey, we want to bring all of our intellectual capacity to this particular issue and see this site be a hub to activate a maritime highway citywide? Or is there some appetite to talk through public space, retail, housing, and how it relates to those other issues I just described? So I'm really curious, with your own organization or your own affiliations hat on, what folks' thoughts are about this. Yeah.
I've talked a lot, so I'm not answering. There's no purpose.
I mean, I just go back to the original concept, right? You had an aging yet somewhat active port facility that needed major investment. You had also a realization that much of the heavy freight was going to shift to Howland Hook and to other parts, which made sense. But we can reinvest in this port, maintain and improve maritime uses. I think there's a home for everybody there personally. I've said this to you, Carolina, many times. And I also think we can create more mixed use opportunity, including retail, because that's kind of where we're at. But for the most part, like, we have to agree that, number one, this has been underinvestment for decades. Number two, that we can't hold on to everything that once was because conditions have changed. And number three, there are many competing priorities that we could seek to address. And I don't think there's anything wrong with us saying that, right? You can't solve for any one problem, but you can chip away at several problems with this one opportunity. I think that's where we should think.
I'll echo a lot of that framing. I think that's why the lack of history here in this presentation and how it's been presented to the public can be, I think, hard to help people understand. There's been such a terrible lack of investment and stymied investment in this property for so long. We're at a point where we can catch up to policy, infrastructure, and investment on this property and make it something. So, for example, this third bullet point, which says, how do we preserve the maritime spaces and use this as an opportunity to revive the waterfront, is kind of a contradiction. Like, we're reviving the maritime because the investment has been stymied for so long, the policy has been lacking for so long. And so I think until we really get something concrete in front of us that says, what could that look like, and bring in all the expertise on how does that mean we're reinventing logistics in New York City, whether it's through highway system or incentives or mandates. I think without that context, we don't even know what reviving this and even making it a functional port, which it hasn't been for a long time, would look like. I think, if we just sort of say, if we build out that picture first, that can, I think, help then figure out what else can happen there. But I think that's that framing of why are we here in the first place, we've been stuck, is important for people to understand. Otherwise, the framing and a lot of the press releases and stuff has been, oh, this poor piece of underperforming land, what should we do with it? I don't think that's a good framing for people to be thinking about.
I just have a question. Do we know what the job density of the current port is right now? Do we know what the job density?
It's
of the-
like.
It's like,
It's like, so, one thing to think about in terms of just putting on the workforce development hat is that you want to increase the job density. Certain things increase job density more than others. Storage, warehousing is not a very job dense thing. So in thinking about that, and if that's something that we're going for, that immediately to me kind of lowers that down. It doesn't mean it takes it off, but less space should be used for things like storage and warehousing and maybe container housing than for maybe more active waterfront usage, maybe more businesses that would use a blue highway or other things. So I get the idea of like conceptualizing what could be, but let's talk about some of the variables of what we're trying to achieve. And then maybe kind of work our way backwards from there.
Another person in
Sure. Sorry to come in late. My name is Nate Gray. I work at the New York City Economic Development Corporation.
I want to say one thing about the port, that first on the jobs piece, I think it's important to remember that also the container port provides union jobs, which are high paying and critical. And I think that there's certain things that the city can do to really pressure the port to capitalize on the niche aspect of this location. It is the only port serving New York City, Brooklyn, and Long Island. The challenge with Howland Hook is that you cannot barge from Howland Hook all the way into Brooklyn. So everything coming into Howland Hook basically goes across to New Jersey. And so even though, yes, Howland Hook is expanding, that does not necessarily translate to a policy goal of bringing things into Brooklyn and then Queens and Long Island on the waterfront. The benefit of this particular location is that the current port operator, but anyone would do this, is focus on niche goods, bringing those niche goods into the city. While it's definitely true that this facility only does about between 1% and 2% of total volume of freight for New York City, that volume is particular. There, that sounds like not a lot because it's 1 or 2%, but it's an important 1 or 2% for the city. So I think there's a jobs piece and a logistics piece there that to me feels really important, and to also talk about what are there any opportunities to incentivize that niche market and expand those operations? I don't know, maybe there's not, but I think that's a deeper question.
You saying that?
No, I was just gonna say, like, I am a huge supporter of unions, but I'm also gonna be honest. Unions have had a terrible track record for the communities in those neighborhoods, Black and brown folks.
Agreed.
So just saying like, oh, they bring good paying, quality jobs, that's true. But typically those folks in those neighborhoods, they don't benefit from it. So we need to be honest about that. And if we're gonna talk about the community we're serving, we need to talk about the community that we're really serving on that. The other piece to that is when it comes like niche services, they tend to be more skilled. They tend to require specialty skills. They tend to require specialty support. That's a lot of training. And it's not cheap training. So we need to be honest about that as well when we're having this conversation.
That doesn't apply to what you're saying. Niche means it's like tropical fruit. So there's not a higher level of skill besides plugging in the generator, or it's lumber. That I think is what she's talking about in terms of it's not the same generalized containerized cargo going to the big ports of New Jersey and how.
Okay.
But I think you're beyond that, though. There is, I totally see what you're saying. If we want to think about increasing the number of advanced manufacturing opportunities on this site or advanced maritime uses on this site, then, certainly what you're talking about applies. Yeah, training for those opportunities is expensive, and I'm sure others can talk about that in the room too.
I want to pick up on what Randy said and actually really differ with this framing of it. This port's kind of over and it's all logically gone to New Jersey. Jesse addressed some of that. But there's also, this was a concern even before the Dolly hit the bridge in Baltimore. If the Bayonne Bridge is hit, all the big ports are on the other side of it. And so there's a significant strategic reason to, and prior to that, it was something that Nadler always brought up, you know, if there's a terrorist attack, you know, that takes out that Bayonne Bridge, we're in trouble as a, not only as a city, but as a region. But specifically also, I'm just gonna say the port is bedraggled, but these are choices. And so the Port Authority chose to not, and nobody enforced the tripartite agreement to make the Port Authority maintain the place. The southern portion of it, which the EDC rented in 2005 for the cruise terminal, has not been managed in a maritime focused way at all. And so there's tremendous capacity there in theory, which is not being used. So and I don't know if everybody knows the maritime language, but the condition of the bulkheads, for example, in Atlantic Basin, they don't have fendering on them. Clinton Wharf, the southern one is collapsing. They're not in any maritime use at all. That's potentially a tremendous amount of activity could be there. And maritime doesn't just mean containers. Maritime doesn't just mean what Red Hook Terminals has been doing. There are lots of ways to activate all that, but the Port Authority really wasn't interested in it. The Port Authority has been wanting to slough this off, and they were open about that for years. So to assess this as not kind of viable for maritime is not accurate or fair. They didn't want it for a bunch of reasons. And the EDC is not focused on, except for the cruise terminal, maritime uses in Atlantic Basin. So there have been totally non-maritime tenants in the shed, which was something that was very, shed meaning, sorry, the enormous Pier 11 warehouse, which is 3 blocks long. That was very concerning to Portside, not only because we're not in there in the space that was promised to us, but the site has not been managed with a maritime focus. So one legacy tenant on the south end of it, where you would see the diagonal lines for non-maritime, that's a legacy of the Port Authority. They actually controlled that building. That's the Secret Service. You know, so, you know.
But the whole point of the city taking over the property is exactly what you just said, Karen. So like, I'm finding what you're saying right now very inconsistent. The Port Authority wasn't doing the job. The Port Authority didn't invest in this site. The Port Authority created the conditions that we have in front of us.
Right, but that doesn't
The
mean.
reason for the swap was that the city, now taking ownership, can come up with an investment plan to make this what it should be, or what it could be at this point in time.
No, there's no contradiction. It could be an incredibly busy maritime facility. The Port Authority.
By the way, you're right about maritime.
Okay.
I didn't say
I'm very
anything,
right
I didn't say about ports. I didn't say about container port. I said maritime is a very expansive. use.
Exactly. So that's what I'm saying. This should be and could be in full, complete, busy maritime use. The Port Authority only does containers. They did a brief thing with PID.
You can get rid of the container port and still have maritime use. You can have all the goods shipped through Howland Hook and New Jersey and have a barge system to get them to Brooklyn and points.
By the way, those ports don't want to
And
handle.
get less trucks off the street. Where the.
Listen, the tropical fruit that's
You can
coming,
create it.
that's the
You can
tropical
create it
fruit
here.
that's going to Hunts Point, I don't think those large ports want those little ships. So some stuff comes on little ships, so it makes sense to have a little ship port, and it's well located. And so I think that makes sense to be there. I think we need to spend more time discussing what Blue Highway looks like and what it actually needs in terms of, you know, unloading and staging and getting it into the smaller units. And so warehousing will come in there because you can't take it from a container and put it on a UPS truck or an e-bike. There has to be a transitional. So I think we should really, if this is the maritime industrial group, not the housing group, I'd like us to get more onto discussing what are maritime operations, logistics currently, and for the future and the potential. There's tremendous untapped, and I feel like we spent a lot of time circling around.
Well, I think that's the follow-up question I was gonna ask you. It's like, okay, we understand the Port Authority gave us the situation that we're in.
They left us.
You highlighted Pier 11 doesn't have a lot of it doesn't have any maritime uses now. Atlantic Basin is not.
No, it has weak. In other words, the EDC,
Right.
the
So my
EDC choice was not to rent.
So my
maritime.
question is, as a part of this process,
Yeah.
what maritime uses would you, like, this is the moment, what maritime uses would you want to see at Pier 11? Like, you just started to talk about it, Blue Highways, you talked about the need for logistics
Well, see,
and
I would look at
position,
the
so
whole-
like, can you expand on that?
I can talk about some specifics, but the way I roll is I would want to, I think there needs to be a long-term freight plan for the city and the adjacent areas and how things are moved. So I can talk about hypotheticals quite specifically, but then it's, what is the footprint needed? Like if the stuff is gonna finally leave Red Hook by water to go to Hunts Point, something I've advocated for since about 2004 and others have before me, I don't know the footprint amount for that. And this is also why I asked about the ferry home board. Because honestly, I've been told there's a flaw with its construction, okay, installation. But at one point, the city was talking about using NYC ferries as moonlighting for freight. Is that going to happen? I know you need to change, and I could talk, I don't want to take up a whole meeting, but you need to change the Coast Guard COI of the boat to use it for freight. Has that happened? Is that possible? Is it, if it's, let me finish. If that's so, it might make sense to actually have a whole bunch of ferries home ported there, because then you can get the stuff right out of the port onto them. But if that home port has failed, or they don't have the COI and the Coast Guard said no, all these things interlock. Also, I would say in terms of public access, there's actually an incredible amount of park and waterfront park in Red Hook and in Brooklyn Bridge Park. The Columbia Waterfront District has no proper park. They have Brooklyn Greenway not using their green space on Columbia Street, and they have 7 community gardens. But I would say if you're gonna do anything, make it more a blue space park, which is Maritime. The EDC did not let us finally be the Maritime Center they originally approved after we did their RFI and RFP. But we would have had vessels that the public could get on, commercial ones, dinner boat, party boat, tour, fishing, to go out on the water, as well as work boats coming in for B2B services, historic and cultural vessels. There are no places nearby for people to get on boats. The Brooklyn Bridge Parks Marina was not, everyone in the harbor thought it was not a well-run. It's gone bankrupt. It didn't provide opportunities for the public to get on the boat. It was too expensive for local people, most local people, to keep boats. It tended to have luxury yachts, very few programming vessels. The park has not had a maritime focus, so people can't get on boats, except for the Mary Whalen in that vicinity.
Understood.
You know, so there are a lot of things that are possible, many things that are possible, Randy. And I don't know how we have that conversation, because I don't want to talk too much in the room, but I feel like that's the conversation that should really be had. Maritime, because this is a precious piece of work in waterfront. Really precious
Yes.
for where it's located and what it can do. And also, I don't understand this thing about no big boats north of the
Let's return to that.
tunnel, because I've seen the ships go north of that to turn around, so.
Let's return to that. I want to hear from some of the workforce folks in the room too. You were going to speak on the ferries.
So, with the maritime piece, so the thing that jumps out at me is that, okay, if we did that, what are the wages? What are the jobs? What's the training? Because if we just said that the unions have a hard time getting people of color in there, they're making strides, and I want to give them that, but they're having a hard time doing that. If they're not union, so if they're union jobs, they still might not get them. If they're non-union jobs, they might not be paid well enough for this to actually be family sustaining wages. We have to care about that. And then the other piece is, like, when we're thinking about other business opportunities for this space, is there some business opportunities that have higher starting entry-level wages that can coexist with a maritime operation? What are those businesses? What do they look like? What are the jobs? What are the occupations? Because, yeah, as a workforce person, I support business because business creates opportunity for folks. But let's be real, business's function is not to hire people. Business's function is to provide a product or service and to make profit off of that. So if we know that, we have to think about that rather than just assume that because we're putting businesses in there, it's going to play out well for the community. So those are my questions, just from a workforce perspective.
Here's the thing, maritime also.
Sorry, I just want to make sure we hear from some other folks.
Sure.
You guys have been quiet. Thoughts on what we did?
I was gonna say that, but I think defining maritime, or like choosing to not define maritime, is important, because we are a high school that focuses on maritime career pathways. But we define maritime as, vessel operations and vessel maintenance, but also we consider welding to be maritime. We consider scuba diving, clearly, to be maritime. Marine affairs is maritime. Marine biology and aquaculture are maritime. So these careers, these training opportunities, put them on these piers. It's still maritime.
Can you speak to some of the businesses in your pipeline for the careers?
Offshore wind. We actually provide a lot of crew to NYC Ferry. It's rare that I ride an NYC ferry without one of our former students, either as captain or crew. We are starting to see a lot of our graduates in environmental organizations. You know, there's definitely not a single answer to that. More and more in towing and you know, even like deep sea maritime. And of course, many in non-maritime careers as well, but that doesn't mean they don't benefit from, you know, from that background.
I mean, I'd like to know more about what the modern maritime looks like if it's not a container port, and figure out what those jobs are. I agree with Nikki that we have to keep a close eye on job quality and opportunity, but I don't think we should just assume that sort of the next generation of businesses and uses of the waterfront are going to necessarily be dead end jobs.
I didn't say that.
No, I know you didn't say that. I just think it's important. And like in workforce, you work backwards from the pain points of the employers, but you also work backwards from what the employer opportunities are. And people say housing, you know what that is. People say modern maritime. You know, it sounds like some of us know what that is, but most of us don't. And I think it's really important that they sort of define that and you put some emphasis in. And I would like to know more about some of the future, right? Like, what's the budget? None of us do anything in organizations without knowing what the costs are, right? So like, are we going to dredge anything? Are we going to fix, which piers are we going to fix? When, how, what's the phasing? Because that's really what the plan's going to be. I don't feel like I got invited into a blank canvas. There's some real goals here, and some of them I agree with, some of them I don't. It doesn't actually matter. The reality is like what's going to happen and when is really important. Because I think if we don't have any jobs on that swath of land, it'll be a tremendous missed opportunity. There's a shit ton of public investment that's going to go there. It should benefit the city and the communities directly. And that is, without question, what we should be doing there. And we have to look beyond the construction jobs for whatever the infrastructure is going to be.
My whole thing with like being focused on, you know, company types is to that point, like we define what is modern maritime. And in defining what's modern maritime, there has to be an intersection point where we're also thinking about jobs, because it's not just about working backwards from the pain point of employers. It is also about paying attention to your point, opportunities, right? And like the chances and the potential businesses that might be there. And that also means looking at businesses who would want to actually invest in workforce development, who want to do local hiring. These all become part of that design process because different companies who are in different places need different build outs for their spaces. They need different types of rooms and different types of power and all of that type of stuff. So in defining the modern maritime, it's also looking at the types of companies that would shape that definition, and then also having to factor in whether or not they are, how much give are we gonna have when we think about the jobs? And how much give are we gonna have when we think about the salaries? Because this is an expensive city. And we can't have it all, but we can do better. And let's be honest, like a lot of these projects need to do better.
I guess, you know, I'll go back to my theme for X decades is that there's opportunity here that can't be given up. If anything is done with this land that's not maritime or industrial, it'll never be replaced again. They're not building any more maritime industrial space in the city. That's why the Navy Yard is the Navy Yard. That's why the Brooklyn Army Terminal is the Brooklyn Army Terminal, right? We can't give it up. There has to be a place to do dirty things, to recycle concrete, to deliver sand, and to do all the things that no one wants in their backyard. And to consider taking this 200 acres or so, whatever. 122 acres. Into doing anything but something that's maritime industrial on it just seems to be absolutely ridiculous to me. We could all debate what the maritime use is. We debated internally at our organization about the job. So we don't lease industrial space to every industrial user because a lot of those jobs are no good. So we don't do warehouse distribution because they're crummy jobs. We only lease space to people who will manufacture things. Then you're talking 50, 60, 70, $100,000 a year. So we could easily define that. The city's going to control the site, or some entity controlled by the city's going to. You could set that on you put that in your mission statement. You're never going to have warehouse distribution there. Maybe UPS is there, but UPS is union jobs and fairly diverse workforce, right? So I don't think this is as difficult. We're not landing people on the moon here. I think you have to understand or accept the premise that you're going to keep it maritime and industrial and then work from there. And let those other competing uses, we certainly need housing, we certainly need other ability to make commerce in the city, but there's plenty of spaces for that and it's done elsewhere. And I personally think retail there would be ridiculous, but that's my personal opinion.
Yes.
We have retail. I mean, just to the front, but.
Now we got a lot of empty storefronts.
Go ahead, Stephen. Thanks for chiming in.
Yeah, sorry, I had to jump off for a call and I have to jump for another one, but I just wanted to chime in here. Everything that you just said, yes, I think that there is an opportunity definitely for maritime resources. New York was a harbor before it was a city. I think that we've lost a lot of our waterfront to competing interests here. Brooklyn, if you look at Brooklyn, it's the only container terminal that is on the other side of the Bayonne Bridge. If something were to happen, then all of our shipping going to New Jersey there would be an issue. There would definitely be an issue trying to get the supply chain up and running. Also, from an OEM standpoint, if something were to happen, to have a working waterfront where support vessels may be able to dock and may be able to provide resources, I think that that's definitely a huge plus for Brooklyn to keep it the way that it is and to re-envision. I think that the question here really is re-envisioning what we can do with Brooklyn to meet the needs of the city. I think that it should be kept as a maritime resource. We have this opportunity to re-envision it. Is that going to be the same 5-10 years down the road? That's for us to kind of determine, and that's for us to debate here. I think that there's a lot of opportunity. Not all vessels are capable of going to New Jersey. There are smaller vessels, there are smaller vessel calls that need to be done. So that's an opportunity as well for these smaller vessels to come to New York. We know that the George Washington Bridge is the biggest bottleneck of trucks. Putting that cargo onto the water makes a lot of sense and getting it north of New Jersey. I think that there's a lot of opportunity here, and I'm very interested in the conversation. I think that we should definitely keep it going and re-envision what Red Hook could look like
Stephen,
to meet the needs.
when you first introduced yourself, you talked a little bit about supply chain activation. And I'm curious if you could expand on that, the supply chain around maritime uses that you see as being attracted to this particular site.
Sure. So if we talk about containerized cargo right now is taken by truck. Like I just said, George Washington Bridge, biggest bottleneck in the whole entire United States. If we are able to re-envision and take those containers by barge to Brooklyn to then be dismantled and then be dispersed among the city, among the 5 boroughs in smaller trucks in different ways of moving cargo, I think that that is really something that this group should look at and should look at that opportunity. The EDC a couple weeks ago just had a marine highway or a blue highway seminar where there were a bunch of vendors that came in to talk about their projects, to talk about what they're trying to bring to the city to get trucks off the road. I think that there's a lot of waterfront that can be utilized that currently right now. I think that there's waterfront properties right now that may not, that may need a little tiny bit of industrial, they may need a little industrial work in order to bring them back to more cargo accepting. Not related to Red Hook, but outside of Red Hook, Hunts Point, for example. Can we bring barges from Red Hook to Hunts Point to get less truck traffic on the roads, to reduce emissions? Maritime in general is one of the most environmentally friendly ways of shipping goods.
Yeah. One thing, we've been talking so much about the workforce development strategies on this site. And SBIDC works with a few of the maritime businesses in Red Hook already, so I have some idea. But Stephen, I'm curious from your perspective, if you could talk through the job opportunities and career pathways that are involved if this site saw an expansion of the cross harbor barge model, which would, of course, potentially result in ship and barge repair services, tug services, a whole host of other supply adjacent opportunities. So do you have anything you want to share with us on the workforce strategies in that sector?
Yeah, so I think that New York Harbor in itself, we have a lot of tug and barge business that already is happening. We have folks that have been in the industry for a long time. We have folks that are coming into the industry. Captain Spear can talk a little bit more about that from the SUNY Maritime perspective. But I think things are changing, right? Things are changing in the maritime. We don't do things the way that containerization just started in 1950s. That's how young it is. So now it's 2024. There's no reason why we can't look at different alternative ways to do things. I think that there's a lot. When people think about maritime, usually it's ocean-going vessels, but there's a lot of harbor crafts. There's a lot of vessels that are operating within the harbor. My colleague from the harbor school was just talking about New York City Waterway and how they have students that are now on those vessels. I think that we need to look at what the assets are and where the holes are and work. Somebody had said it earlier, see where the holes are and work towards that employment outcome.
So I want to build on what Mickey was saying and what he said and what I had said earlier. And that I felt like the table was kind of presuming that maritime activity there meant containers and the jobs on the land. And I'm talking about the jobs on the water. And so the marine highway thing will mean, oh, James, do you want to speak?
Yeah, I mean, just if you can, just for a second, I appreciate the opportunity. Don't
I
want to
kept
take
looking to
much,
see if you had your hand up, so.
too much time. Yeah. So, I mean, I would echo what exactly what Stephen said, and I'm certainly happy to put together a sort of working list of ancillary jobs that are associated with greater marine infrastructure, not just in the early development stage, but also in the ongoing operation stage. And we have graduates who work across the full array of maritime jobs. You know, if it has to do with shipping, we probably have someone who's done it and continues to do it. So the only thing I would echo as well from Stephen is, given not just the local mandates, but what we see internationally, the global mandates to reduce shipping's environmental footprint, there is a pretty strong trend in our European counterparts and friends across the Atlantic to embrace short sea shipping to a greater degree than it already has, right? They have a widespread infrastructure for transshipment of materials, that final mile, final couple of miles, in order to reduce traffic on limited roadways. And so I don't have the data like Stephen does in terms of George Washington Bridge or roadway congestion across New York. But as a general point, shipping, yes, is generally the most environmentally benign as well as most efficient forms of transportation, safe for pipeline. I'm happy to answer any other questions in terms of workforce development. We, like I said, are fortunate enough to have graduates who work across the full array of maritime services, both direct operations, but also finance, law, you know, all of the support services, many of which would have a direct role in whatever the project ultimately looks like.
So
I would love that list.
So Thank you for that, James. And so going back to what I said earlier, I mean, their jobs on the water, my understanding from the harbor is there's actually a crisis now. There's a shortage of crew. And it pains me to hear it because the ports have been able to start our training, by now we'd have kids, in our program, but there is a real need for crew in the harbor. And so the terminology is brown water, and there's multiple terminology, brown water and blue water. So blue water is going across the ocean, those international sailing vessels. There's a lot of brown water. And so, by the way, the NYC ferry, and I totally hear you, and it's really an issue, like the ILA is extraordinarily white and has been, and the staff in that port, but they're moving the stuff on the land. The other stuff that we're talking about, the other smaller boats, the NYC ferry has done an incredible job, with their diversity, they're hiring, people of color, women of color, in every kind of way, and that's not typical. I mean, I have to say, I spent a lot of time on tugboats and other ferry, the tugboat industry in particular has still stayed very white and very male. But that can't last forever. And the thing about these jobs is you can then, if you like working on boats, you can then go on to blue water. I mean, the salaries, we haven't done a salary survey of the towing industry, for example, in years, because we don't have, unfortunately, the space to do the workforce training, but we did it back in the 2005 business plan. And the salaries compared, they were incredibly good, in comparison to NYCHA in particular salaries. And it was walk to work. Red Hook actually has working waterfront outside of here. There are an incredible number of tugboats in Red Hook based there, and those companies were desperate for work, but the community wasn't connected to Maritime, and that divide kind of still exists there. But I think to get this marine highway thing going, and I had questions in here, like what vessel types, I don't know whether the EDC has gone further along, what vessel types are you talking about? Tugs and barges are slower, than fast ferries. There can be freight ferries. There can be, dedicated boats that are, self-unloading. They have those in Europe. And so, I mean, I think it would be helpful to hear from the EDC as to how far along they are in those sorts of things. I mean, I know the hypotheticals, we are lagging way behind in this country, but particularly in New York in comparison to Europe. And to be honest, I think it's because the real estate industry has a big influence in this city. And so consequently, our maritime and industrial waterfront has been picked off for luxury housing because that's who runs the city. But that has not helped us get to a good freight plan. And I think we now understand, climate change, traffic, what the pandemic did, e-commerce, youth DOT, dealing with what's going on the roads. I don't envy you. And so, but that's right. I'm sorry, deep, you live in deep. But there are a bunch of variables. I mean, there are many options. There are existing models elsewhere, but the city isn't really there yet. And the EDC has been talking about some of this since Port NYC, that's like 2018. So, I mean, I'm part of a Blue Highways Coalition. I've been trying to talk to them, like, it would be really helpful if this coalition would just start to educate people as to what this looks like. And I don't know where to go with this, but there are lots of jobs. They're not all on land. They pay really well. They're stepping stones to something else. And a traditional trajectory in life is when you're younger, you're on the boats, and then you come ashore at a certain point, and then you're in the administration and the management and the accounting and the law and the purchasing. You get off the boats because boat work is harder and you're away from your family if you have a family. But there's a lot of potential work here, jobs, but it's not all on land. But I think if we're gonna be talking about freight, it isn't the highest job per acre because the stuff is big. Even the boats, if you look at a tugboat that has, let's say, 7 crew on it, it's a lot of space with just 7 people.
And
I just wanted to say a couple of things. And one is that just for you specifically, and Stephen, I was at NOAA in DC the other week, and they were working on a program trying to figure out what does the workforce need to look like for addressing changing climate.
Yeah.
And we're asking for specifics. Do you have job titles that we can, start thinking about to be promoting? Because in my work now, we're starting to take on the coastal infrastructure that's being built around the city. So the gates,
Right.
the flood walls. But yes, I know I need these exact union titles to be able to do my job. And they're just like aching for that data. So the job list, other ideas you have, I think I'm gonna have a meeting with them.
That's marine construction. That's actually maritime work, a lot of it.
A lot of it could be. So I'm talking to them about my walls and how to maintain my maintain and operate this particular asset class. But it's triggered, this conversation has just triggered the notion that they would probably want to talk to you all as well about what type of jobs you see. That's an aside. But as I'm listening to you now, so I've been with the city for about a year, me thinking through what is our relationship to the coast look like in the future, in 2150, what do we want it to be? And I feel like that is a question that this table should tackle for this specific site. And I feel like you're getting there, but not 100%, saying what you want this coast to be or this site to be, other than I heard really strongly to maintain the maritime use. And so the question is, how do you now articulate that in a way that others who are not maritimers or thinking about all these other competing interests can really get it and get compelled by it? And then the blue highway component is a big part of that. What does this site mean at different scales to the local community and then to the city as a whole? And I think we need to get there. But oh God, I just lost my train of thought because I went on a tangent. But so what is the vision? Oh, I know what it is. What's the balance that you could tolerate between maritime and other uses? Because if we have to figure out how to pay for all of this infrastructure, and there is no big purse of money, there's a grant here, there's a grant there, but long term, what can this site provide in terms of revenue generation to enable this vision that you want to create from this perspective of this task force, right? Because there are going to be some trade-offs. And then the next question is, what is the maritime activity in and of itself? What can it generate to be self-funding, right? Does it have to be housing as the like, we don't love it, but this is what we need to do to be able to get the generate funds to get this piece of it? Or can we maintain the vision without it? And I'm not sure, as a layperson on this team, what the answers are, but those are the questions that I think we should get.
Clarify that I'm not an expert either, but like, to me, it's clear that the maritime positive impacts for our communities is environmental justice. It's about traffic reduction. Like Southwest Brooklyn is heavily impacted by driving traffic. We are currently using Purple Air Monitors, a Red Hook initiative, to measure air quality in Red Hook. And on the orange sky days that we just had very recently, you could see, and you could see this almost on any day of the week, as close as Carroll Gardens, as close as Park Slope, there is an exponential worse impact on Red Hook as a neighborhood environmentally on any given day, especially on days that are orange and hazy. So I think that is a tremendous value of maritime. I think that the job opportunities, and if there is training and growth opportunities and it's local, Red Hook is a neighborhood that is highly geographically isolated, and getting around and only being able to use the F and G and then not having the G and having two buses drive through every once in a while. It is a tremendously difficult neighborhood to get around. And having better environmental protections and having access to hyper local jobs is tremendously meaningful to that neighborhood.
Yeah. And this is into the question about the balance. This is why I said, like, what are not just the adjacent, but complementary types of jobs, because not everybody is going to want to be on a boat.
That's true.
And so, like, Mike, you were talking about like offshore wind and welding. Welding is a great example of something that feeds a lot of different industries here in the city. I'm in the process of thinking through welding on the yard. Why? Because I have our shipbuilder. I also have people who are doing construction. I have people who do installations and all these things. So there are some traditional manufacturing roles that fold into this and that can lend itself to other businesses in that same space. So across this idea of balance, I think that's what I mean is like, yes, I'm not disputing that it should be, maritime. It's waterfront. I'm from Florida. That's what you do. But
Good to know.
yeah, but at the same time, not everybody's going to be able to feed into that. Opportunities are going to look different for everybody. You can't just put that into the community and say like, this is going to be the thing, because there's a diversity of interest there. And we want to be mindful of that because it is geographically isolated. And I think that's why I feel so passionately about the jobs and the training, because you're also talking about possibly having to have training on site because it's hard to get around in Red Hook. So they're gonna go all the way uptown to get trained to come back downtown. So that's why I said these are the other factors that go into this when you're thinking about building up an industrial zone that we just have to consider as well.
We only have about 10 minutes left, and I know it's been a really long conversation. We have 2 more advisory group meetings, so I want to make sure we understand clearly what the next steps are. I also love some of the recent framing that you provided around thinking through how this group can put forward a vision for the site that focuses around what does this coast mean for our community? What does this coast look like if we're talking about primarily focusing on maritime industrial uses and workforce development? And also access. Accessibility was a word we heard in the room when we first did intros multiple times. So I think that's great. But let me turn it over to Chris so we can get through next steps.
Can I make one more
Please.
comment before I wanted to make sure this got said. It's one thing that I think that we don't need is more piers with fences around them. And every time we have one of these conversations, not about this, but just, anywhere in the city, right? Let's talk about this because New York City is really good at rebuilding piers, existing piers, and putting fences around them and making, nice places for people to play. But that's another access point that we lose. When we did our little, and I said access as my word, I'm not really thinking about access from land. I'm thinking about access from water. And somewhat selfishly, right? Working at a school on Governor's Island, Brooklyn Marine Terminal is in our backyard, but only if there's a back door, right? We can't get there if you build fences around the piers. So.
Yeah. That reminds me actually of what, one of the 2 fellows up there said about emergency management. So I was a photojournalist when 9/11 happened. And the BMT piers were important evacuation areas first on the morning of 9/11. And I was on a boat documenting this, and then I spent months documenting 9/11. So many thousands of people were evacuated from Lower Manhattan straight over there. And then most of the rubble was removed by water, when the maritime industry explained that to the city, that was a better way to get to faster recovery of ground zero. It reduced the removal of the rubble from the projected 2 years to 8 months. And it took the trucks off the road, but also prevented the dispersal of all that toxic dust, which I know lots ago, from the city streets. And so they used the Wall Street heliport for the large structural steel, and then over at Hudson River Park, Pier 25 for the smaller stuff, which was frankly not too small itself. But the Red Hook piers were used as staging areas for the empty barges before they went over there. So they have served an emergency.
Just thank everyone for such a rich conversation. Want to talk about sort of the next meeting.
And the reason I mentioned this, because when Mike Cohen said that the fences, Brooklyn Bridge Park put up a fence on the pier that was actually used for evacuation. And I said, and they put the fence in between the bollard that you need to tie up the vessel. I said, why did you do that? I said, because we don't plan to have boats there. I'm like, why would you have a pier which you never plan to have boats, but you've actually just incapacitated the pier for emergency evacuation? Yeah, you don't do that. Mike's right.
So couple of just housekeeping items. I think we're going to be reaching out soon, working with Jesse to get the next meeting on the calendar so everyone has time to prepare and can attend. At our next meeting, which we anticipate happening in December, we're going to recap. We'll also share out a summary of today's meeting with notes. We'll provide a process update in terms of what engagement has taken place since this meeting. By that point, we will be close to or have finished a set of workshops. And so we want to make sure that you have sort of the readout from those. And then we anticipate sort of having more detailed planning analysis to sort of talk through, and also inserting the market and financial piece as well. And so we'll be excited to sort of dive into that. But we'll be working with Jesse really closely to sort of plan out that agenda. And just to give you a sense of some other engagement, we've had ongoing sort of advisory group and public site tours. Those have been really great. I think we have one more tomorrow. We will also be releasing a sort of public engagement summary that sort of basically describes and outlines everything we've heard to date. Hopefully that will be out in the next week or so. We talked about public workshop too. And we're also, I think it's important to highlight, working with Red Hook Houses East and West to coordinate a tour and focus group with the tenant associations. We're also going to be organizing a set of focus groups, one focused on youth, one focused on monolingual Spanish speakers and monolingual Mandarin speakers as well. So I think just to say we're hyper aware of who we're connecting with and not connecting with, and we'll be continuing to update our engagement strategy sort of based off that.
A tour of.
It would be a tour of the site, yes. And I've been in touch with Catherine, so maybe we can.
Oh, awesome, yeah.
I think that's next slide.
Is there a next task force meeting between now and the end?
Yes, the next task force meeting is next Wednesday.
I have a couple of just like information requests so that we can gather a little bit more information. It'd be helpful to know whether federal funding requires, the PLA for any of that, so we understand what job opportunities are there. The community has heard that there can be no local job requirements at this site. I don't think that's true. There are existing ones with some of the contracts. I would like
some of the contracts with the grants received recently, or
so the current Ports America contract includes local hiring clause, but the community has heard that local hiring is not possible for the future of the site, and I just want to find out if that's actually true, and if so, why. What are the city partners for workforce development that would be working here and helping to support long-term? I think what you brought up about sort of meaningful workforce development, long-term workforce development is really important. We've heard that the Hornblower is moving their site here. I've also heard that they're moving their corporate offices here. It'd be helpful to know what kinds of jobs there. That was,
We
that
gotta
was on the
talk.
bus tour, but, when we're talking about freight, are we only talking about wholesale? Are we also incorporating direct to consumer freight? I think those are some questions that would be helpful.
And I just quickly to respond, I think some of the questions you raised will be worked out through this planning process. I think the ones that we can address, we certainly will, but others will come later as part of the planning process.
I have some other information.
For the EDC, but who are you hearing those questions from? Who's bringing up like Hornblower, corporate offices being?
That came up on the bus tour. It was described as being the offices, not just the mechanics shed. So I was just trying to get clarification on that.
I would like clarification on where that 164 million federal DOT mega grant is going to go, because I think it was the elected's letter of support referred to Atlantic Basin issues. Your presentation talked about a focus on the demolition of piers 9A and 9B and making a marginal pier. But I and others want to know, what is the plan for that money? And like, we're overdue to hear that. I emailed Goldman's office in crickets. So,
My understanding is the majority of the funding for the mega grant will go towards the marginal pier at 9A.
That's right, I can answer that now. So,
oh, great, thank you, rock star.
so it's, again, Nate Gray from the Economic Corporation.
Okay,
The total is $270 million.
okay,
60 of it is, 163.8 of it is from the federal grant.
got it.
It's for reconstructing 9A and 9B for marginal pier, repairing Pier 10, which today have existing issues,
Mhm.
and then doing transportation improvements to improve circulation.
Is the improving circulation Atlantic Basin, because a letter of support, no,
I mean, it could be, but I'm saying it's not fully defined. We're
Okay.
working through this process is going to help us define.
okay, because Red Hook is really, the cruise traffic is a big concern, so I wanted for that audience to find out about that. The other thing is
I just want to, we're almost at time, so is it pertinent for the group or?
yes, it is, because the EDC is, and basically, and through you, saying that we need to cross-subsidize, blah, 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 blah. And the question that I asked to the EDC at a January 16 meeting at the MICIO Center, convened by Alexa Aviles, which had a focus on cruise terminal issues, is, can we get from the EDC, how much the EDC has been making on the site, which is just Atlantic Basin at that point, gross and net, since the EDC has managed it?
And so I asked that then for a bunch of reasons, but now it's important to know because is this site, how much revenue was the current management style actually throwing off? And then if we can extract that from the Port Authority, because what I had heard, the Port Authority was officially saying we're losing money here. Then people who I consider to be informed but can't reveal were saying to me, actually, that's not true. They were saying that because they're trying to get rid of the port. But they were pressuring the two port operators, the current one and the prior one, which is why some non-maritime uses like garbage truck parking ended up in there because they were told, if you can make this rent, we'll leave you alone, was how it was described to me. So I think it would help the discussion of finances, economics, subsidy and everything to know really what's the revenue for real on both pieces of it. Oh, sorry, there's actually three pieces because the Port Authority was managing 7 and 8. So they were managing 7 and 8. Then there's Red Container Terminal and then there's Atlantic Basin. So it was 3 pieces, now 1.
Oh, can I just add, what would be helpful too is to think about your timeline for tenant attraction. Because even as this is going into construction, you're still gonna, in order to have people to move in, you're still gonna have to start that tenant attraction while it's in construction. And I think that would be very helpful in terms of thinking about workforce and all of those types of things. Because your workforce aims can also drive your tenant attraction goals as well.
Yeah, I think, and just a lot of our questions are around what are the possible uses, what are the possible tenants? I think, and in terms of revenue as well, we can't just look at this example because it has not been properly managed for a very long time. We actually need to look at finances of well-functioning ports, and that's information we've been asking for a long time. In addition to how the layout works and the types of tenants that can all be working together, I think we need to look at examples that are not this port because it hasn't been well managed.
Is that part of the market analysis that CNH are doing?
Looking at other well-functioning ports. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, and I'll answer that. So the Borough PH is for Borough Apples. Borough Apples is working with Moffett and Nicol, and they're doing precedent research of other ports. And then using that experience, like the components, what are the components of those ports? And then those are some of the inputs into what we're looking at for the financial.
None of that was done before the swap.
Excuse me.
None of that was done before the swap. Like EDC didn't think like.
It wasn't part of the planning.
I don't mean to put you on the spot.
No,
It seems
no,
like if I'm gonna.
I can't say, to my knowledge, it wasn't, but there was certainly, there was a whole financial analysis that was done associated with the swap. What was the components of that? I don't know.
That makes sense.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.